We are all aware about what has been happening in Kenya over the last few months with regard to security issues, or rather insecurity. Going back to the Westgate attack of September last year, we've had several attacks, gun attacks, grenade attacks, improvised explosive devices that have been left in places that have harmed the general public. But in addition to that, we know that the general state of security in Kenya has been seriously a matter for concern. We've had conflicts, intra-ethnic conflicts going on in various places around the country. We've also had opinion polls that show that a lot of Kenyans are feeling very insecure. And of course, that worries us because security is a fundamental human right.
The very high intensity attacks continued up to July. But since then, we have had sporadic attacks spreading to other areas like Trans Nzoia, Kakamega, Vihiga. We saw some attacks in Mwingi that looked exactly like they were taking the same pattern like the attacks we saw in Busia. So the gangs were of between 15 to 25 people. In all the villages we went to, we found descriptions of 15 to 25 people. Apart from one village in Busia where there were 60 people who attacked that village that night. And then they were well organized. They wore long, dark raincoats. Some people had descriptions of heavy boots. They thought they were police. But I think there was no indication that they were really police. I think they were just organized. They were being funded, so they had ability to purchase some of these things. Sometimes they covered their faces, but they all had spotlights, very powerful spotlights, which sometimes they would use to shine on people and just confuse them and attack them. The gangs were mixed identity. There were descriptions of people who spoke Kibukusu. There were descriptions of people who spoke Kiteso. There were people who spoke a dialect just from Uganda, just outside the border. There were people who spoke Kikuyu, and there were people who spoke, a few said they had people who spoke Luo. And they were trained. We talked to some of them, the attackers, who claimed they had been trained in all forms of fighting, whether physical or gun combat. And they talked of training camps in Kenya and outside Kenya, in particular Uganda, in places like Mbale and towns just outside Mbale. We heard that these camps are still active. They never really closed. So the recruitment is still going on, and we don't really quite understand what the eventual goal is. Even though they were really trained, there were no instances where they used guns. They used mostly crude weapons. But the people we talked to who had been trained said actually it was deliberate. They had been trained in everything, but they were deliberately using crude weapons. There were two key leaders who were responsible for payment and coordination of the gangs in the two counties, and they're based in Malaba. I don't know those who know Malaba town, just after Bungoma as you cross the border to Uganda. And these two key leaders were answerable to their bosses in Eldoret, Nakuru, and Nairobi. We didn't think they picked phones from people, they picked some utensils from people, some electronics, but when we finally got down to looking at exactly what transpired, theft didn't look like their actual motive. Because in some homes, they would pick electronics, and then leave the electronics in the next home. In some homes, they were offered money to spare their lives, but they told them, no, we don't want your money, we were just sent to kill you. In Bungoma particularly, we had names of several politicians who were involved in funding these gangs. We had names of businessmen in Bungoma, Busia, and Malaba. These businessmen own big hotels, and they also own petrol stations or filling stations in the 3 towns, Bungoma, Malaba, Busia. Police seemed to think that some Busia politicians were involved, but when we went deeper into it, we didn't find any evidence. But Bungoma politicians, there was a very huge mention of Bungoma politicians. We even found some of the gang members who confessed to having been paid directly by one politician.
For the longest time and until Westgate, these low-profile attacks had been ignored by the authorities. They were largely ignored by the authorities, and they became part of the narratives of poor people. And if you get lobbed into by a grenade and die in the process, you could have died of a road accident as well. So it's a death. So what does it matter? You died, you died. You could die of a road accident, you could have died of hunger, but it just happens that somebody shot you because they were carrying out a terrorist attack. But what has happened is that since Westgate and since the outrage, the national outrage that Westgate caused, the relatively small types of attacks that the authorities had ignored and the media had ignored and downgraded have now been centralized into our national conversation, and I think that's a good thing. Now, the low-profile attacks have had high levels of consequences on the population. In 2012, there were more than 30 of them around the country, and they resulted in casualties, including more than 55 people dead. And if you take into account the numbers killed in 2013 and exclude the Westgate attack, whose numbers we don't know, the media said 67. We don't know where the media gets that number. That number was never given by anybody. They kept giving us numbers, and then they stopped. And when they stopped, the media concluded that it's 67. There is no official number of people dead in Westgate.
To what extent should we accept when government says that it is necessary, that human rights really can be thrown out of the window? Does that make us any safer? I would really want to reject the argument that you often hear that civil society only cares about the terrorists and the attackers and doesn't care about the victims. No one has a monopoly of sympathy for the victims of terrorism. They are also our brothers and our sisters, our parents, our children, and we are just as much at threat of falling victims to an attack as any other Kenyan. Perhaps not those Kenyans in the elite who've managed to surround themselves with all sorts of security apparatus at the expense of the security of the general public, but we are all at threat, and we all feel equally wounded when anyone is impacted on by these brutal attacks. And of course, perhaps it's a natural response to seek simple answers to complex issues, and to seek to separate out the perceived purveyors of insecurity, those who bear the germ of insecurity, whom we think we can identify by their appearance or by their ethnic belonging. That may be a natural response, but does it make us safer? Can we conceive of Kenya being secure without the Somalis in Kenya and in Somalia also being secure? Would a withdrawal from Somalia secure us from further threat? I hope that that's something that we will be able to to discuss here as well today, because these sort of calls naturally arise when you have a threat, then proceeding to view some parts of the community as other and stamping them as other, and then making them fair game and easy prey to be preyed on by the security forces. This has happened here, and we don't think that this is a legitimate or correct response, or one that will increase our security. Indeed, we think that it's a gross breach of human rights of Kenyan citizens and visitors and refugees and others who have been found within our borders. We've all heard the reports of people who've been arrested, having bribes extorted from them, and it seems that it's those who have no money to pay the bribes who end up incarcerated and in detention and deported, etc.
When we look from the 90s, there's a sharp deterioration in security. And that's when the economy began to plunge. We had inflations at rates we hadn't had before. There was also a lot of intense political activism, at the same time intense counter-activism, counter-actions to repress political dissension and so on. We also see a spike, a significant spike in urban crime, in violent crimes. Carjackings become the norm. So from the 90s, even as the political situation became tense, as there was a push for multi-party democracy, even after that was achieved, the security patterns follow that. The thing that then we see about the waves of crime is that the responses we've seen from the security sector, and even the conversations that happen within the public spaces around questions of insecurity, have always shadowed what the waves of the crime. So when it comes to a crest, so when you have intensive carjacking incidents, then you find that there's a response that deals with that particular incident. And when that dissipates, and so the conversation on security has not been as consistent. It's been shadowing the patterns of crimes, the waves of crimes, the waves of insecurity issues as they have come. And that's, in a sense, no different from what we're seeing now, because we're faced, obviously, with the very prominent threat of terrorism and the effects of that. And so the conversations around security are increasingly becoming around terrorism. So in a sense, sort of by looking back very quickly, if you remember in the 1990s and the carjackings, you remember the very prominent police hunt for Wanugu, Washushu, and that was played out in the media almost like this old Western, where there were the villains and there were the police, cowboys and robbers. And when they were shot down, there was a sense of security is being restored. And there'd been this very public sort of pursuit of them, and then very public shootouts, and then it was reported constantly in the media that, security is being restored through these actions. And some of the police responses were like the flying squad. If you remember that there was a certain terror about if you had this 504 Peugeot, 5 men sitting inside, driving around at night, and the fear was if you're caught, and the disappearances that went with that. So this has been sort of the pattern. And then you come into the 2000s, the carjackings increase, issues of course, rape and killings that go with that. And then we also have, in the lead up to some of the elections, you have rise of vigilante groups as a major challenge, particularly in the low-income areas. But then the prominence of Mungiki, and then the response to that, the issues that were attributed to Mungiki actions and the response to that. So there's been that pattern of where there's a crest in certain kind of crimes, the responses have followed that wave.
And the actual challenge of security provision must be that the security actors must always be a step ahead of those who want to cause insecurity. And I think the challenge we have in this country is that the security providers are not ahead of those who want to cause insecurity. And the consequence of that is that we spend too much time on the sideshows instead of reorganizing our act to focus really very clearly on those aspects of security provision that are important to us. And so the point that should run through my presentation this morning should be that a notion of security that focuses on the state, a notion of security that focuses on the state, state-centric notions of security are 17th century notions of security. The Westphalian notion of security, we are constructing a state for you to be recognized within the international system as existing as a state, there must be reciprocity between the two. And the cardinal element of that is that you must assure me that within your territory, you are capable of controlling all legitimate forms of violence. It's a 17th century notion, mostly. And several years ago, there was a report that was issued that said, look, this notion of security in which the state provides and the citizens receive is outdated. It's outdated completely.
We've discovered that the police lacks a strategic focus on how to deal with modern crime. The police are still cocooned in the old thinking of the rudimentary policing, and they don't want to allow new ideas to assist them to police this country in a modern manner. Police are still resistant to change because they feel the status quo made some of them very rich, made some of them demigods, and majority of them have been having roughshoes with the Kenyan people without accounting to anybody because they were the law unto themselves. Now, how can this persist for 2 years? My view is that the leadership that we placed to manage our police service has failed. Because the Inspector General was supposed to be a strategic manager. He was supposed to give directions, come up with policies that are derived from the Cabinet Secretary, because within the law and the Constitution, the Cabinet Secretary is the policy maker for the policing in this country. So you derive policy issues from the Cabinet Secretary, implement them within the police service, and ensure that you give us what we feel is the right method of policing this country. It has not happened. While I don't want to divert into what is happening in Isli and into what's happening in other places, you can see for yourself that if the issue, the third pillar of professionalism, had been taken very seriously, we'll be seeing different things in what we are seeing in Isli. We'll be seeing different things in what is happening in Mombasa. But that pillar was quietly shoved aside because their thinking is that once you have a new curriculum, then you are professionalizing. If you recruit 7,000 police officers and you have a number of 80,000, how are you professionalizing the police? By having new recruits who are going through a new curriculum. What about the 65,000 that are already there? Some have never been back to Kiganjo or Embakasi for the last 20, 25 years. So all these things we are seeing is because somebody decided professionalism was not an issue, and it's because of poor leadership. We are now thinking, probably those of us in this sector, that probably we should have taken a civilian to be in charge of this service. And somebody said, but if a civilian is made the Inspector General, the police will refuse to work with him. That is mutiny. In law, we charge all of them 80,000, we put them into the coolers, we bring other people to take charge. The police, the military second role is to assist civilian police in maintaining law and order.